was heading home for Christmas, catching a red-eye flight from LAX to JFK. The airport was packed with holiday travelers, all of us eager to get home to our families. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have snagged a window seat. As we boarded, the plane had that festive feel. Flight attendants wearing Santa hats, tinsel strung along the overhead bins. It all seemed so normal, you know? We took off without a hitch. I settled in, put on my headphones, and started watching a movie. About an hour into the flight, I noticed the seatbelt sign come on. Didn't think much of it at first, just some routine turbulence, right? But then things started to get a bit rougher. The plane was shaking more than usual, and I could see some worried looks on the faces around me. I paused my movie and took off my headphones. That's when I realized how bad it was getting. The plane was really starting to bounce around. Suddenly there was this huge jolt. It felt like we'd hit an invisible wall mid-air. My stomach lurched and I gripped my armrest so hard my knuckles turned white. Then came the announcement we all dreaded. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, telling us to fasten our seatbelts and prepare for severe turbulence. The tension in the cabin was palpable. I could hear people whispering, some praying, others trying to comfort their seatmates. What happened next is something I'll never forget. The plane suddenly dropped. It wasn't like any turbulence I'd experienced before. This was a free fall. My body lifted off the seat, only held down by my seatbelt. The overhead bins flew open and bags started tumbling out. Drinks, laptops, books, anything that wasn't secured went flying. The worst part? A flight attendant who had been trying to get to her jump seat was thrown to the ceiling. I watched in horror as she hit the top of the cabin and then fell back down, crumpling in the aisle. A couple of passengers rushed to help her, but another violent shake of the plane sent them stumbling. Oxygen masks deployed, dangling in front of us like some surreal Christmas decorations. The cabin filled with a chorus of gasps and screams. I fumbled with my mask, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get it on. The air felt thin, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably about 15 minutes, we were tossed around like we were inside a giant blender. Up, down, left, right. The plane lurched in every direction. I kept looking out the window, trying to get some sense of what was happening. All I could see were dark, angry clouds illuminated by flashes of lightning. Each flash made my stomach turn, knowing we were surrounded by a massive storm. I've never been so sure I was going to die. Every time the plane dropped, I thought, this is it, we're going down. I found myself thinking about my family waiting for me, about all the things I wished I'd said or done. It's amazing how your whole life seems to flash before your eyes in moments like these. The turbulence was relentless. Items continued to fly around the cabin. I saw a laptop smash into the side of someone's head. People were crying, vomiting, praying out loud. The noise was deafening, a mix of the storm outside, the plane's straining engines, and the cacophony of human fear inside. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, there was this loud bang from somewhere on the plane. The whole aircraft shuddered. Alarms started blaring in the cockpit. We could hear them even from where we were sitting. That's when real panic set in. People started shouting, asking what was happening, if we were going to crash. The captain came on again, his voice tense but controlled. He announced we were diverting for an emergency landing. Where? I had no idea. All I knew was that we were descending rapidly. The plane was still shaking, but not as violently as before. We broke through the cloud cover and I could see lights below. A city, an airport, I wasn't sure. As we approached the ground, the tension in the cabin was unbearable. Everyone was braced for impact, unsure if we'd make it down in one piece. The flight attendants were shouting instructions, but their voices were drowned out by the noise of the engines and the wind. We hit the runway hard. The impact jolted through the entire plane. I heard tires screeching, felt the brakes working overtime. Carry-on items that had stayed put during the turbulence now came loose, raining down on passengers. Something hit me on the head. Hard. My vision blurred, and I felt dizzy. As the plane finally came to a stop, there was this surreal moment of silence. Then Chaos erupted again as everyone rushed to get out. Emergency slides deployed and people started evacuating. I was dazed, my head throbbing. I remember unbuckling my seatbelt, standing up, and then nothing. The last thing I saw was the floor of the airplane rushing up to meet me as I blacked out. Hey there. Hope you're enjoying the video so far. If you do, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps the channel to grow and reach more people. And now. We'd been planning this trip to New York City for months. My wife and I wanted to give our daughter a special Christmas experience, you know? See the big tree at Rockefeller Center. Maybe catch a show on Broadway. We're from a small town in Ohio, so the big city was going to be a real treat for all of us, especially our 6-year-old. We arrived in the city a few days before Christmas. The excitement was palpable. The streets were decked out with lights and decorations, and there was this constant buzz of activity everywhere. Our daughter was wide-eyed, taking it all in. We spent the first couple of days doing the usual tourist stuff, Central Park, the Empire State Building, that sort of thing. On Christmas Eve, we decided to brave the crowds and head to Times Square. We'd heard it was crazy busy, but nothing could have prepared us for what we saw. The place was absolutely packed. People everywhere, lights flashing, music blaring from every direction. It was overwhelming, even for us adults. We were making our way through the crowd, my wife and I each holding one of our daughter's hands. She was bouncing with excitement, pointing at all the giant screens and colorful billboards. We stopped for a moment to look at a street performer, some guy dressed as the Statue of Liberty. That's when it happened. I felt my daughter's hand slip out of mine. I turned to grab it again, but she wasn't there. In the split second it took me to look at the performer and back, she had vanished. I called out to my wife, who was still holding our daughter's other hand, or so we thought. But when she turned around, her face went pale. Our little girl was gone. The panic hit me like a truck. We started calling out her name, spinning around, trying to spot her little red coat in the sea of people. But there were just too many bodies, too much movement. It was like trying to find a needle in a haystack, only the haystack was alive and constantly shifting. We split up, each taking a direction to search. I pushed through the crowd, my eyes darting everywhere, looking for any sign of her. The cold was biting, but I barely noticed it. All I could think about was my little girl, lost and alone in this massive, uncaring crowd. Time seemed to stretch on forever. Minutes felt like hours. I kept replaying the moment in my head, that last second when I felt her hand in mine, trying to figure out how she could have slipped away so quickly. I asked everyone I could, other tourists, shop owners, security guards. Most people just shook their heads or shrugged, too caught up in their own holiday rush to really care. As it got darker, the temperature dropped even more. My fingers were numb from the cold, but I couldn't stop searching. My wife and I would meet up periodically, each time hoping the other had found her. But each time we'd see the look in each other's eyes and know we had to keep searching. We contacted the police, gave them a description. They said they'd keep an eye out. But in a place like Times Square on Christmas Eve, there wasn't much they could do immediately. They told us most lost kids are found within a few hours. But as those hours ticked by, that reassurance started to feel hollow. I started to imagine the worst. What if someone had taken her? What if she was hurt, lost and scared in some alley? The thoughts were like a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. But I couldn't stop moving, couldn't stop looking. We searched everywhere we could think of. We retraced our steps a dozen times. We checked every store, every restaurant, every nook and cranny we could find. I even looked in trash cans, terrified I'd find her little red coat discarded somewhere. As we hit the 3-hour mark, I was starting to lose hope. My wife was in tears and I wasn't far behind. The holiday cheer around us felt like a sick joke. How could everyone be so happy when our world was falling apart? That's when I saw him, a guy acting shifty near a parked car. Something about him caught my eye. He kept looking around nervously, like he was waiting for someone. I don't know what made me walk towards him. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was some kind of parental instinct. As I got closer, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. a child's cry coming from the car. I ran the last few steps, my heart pounding, and there she was, in the back seat. My little girl. She was crying and looked terrified, but she was alive. I yelled for help, for the police, for anyone. The guy tried to run, but a couple of bystanders grabbed him. It all happened so fast after that. Police sirens, people gathering around, my wife rushing over when she heard my shouts. I wrenched open the car door and grabbed my daughter. She was shaking, crying, clinging to me like she'd never let go. I held her tight, barely able to believe she was really there in my arms. The police took the guy away. They asked us questions, but I was barely listening. All I could focus on was my daughter, making sure she was really okay. She was scared and confused, kept saying the man had promised her candy and a puppy if she went with him. It hit me then how close we'd come to losing her forever. If I hadn't noticed that guy, if we'd given up and gone back to the hotel, if any number of tiny things had been different, she might have been gone for good. We didn't stay to see what happened to the guy. As soon as the police said we could go, we left. I carried my daughter the whole way back to our hotel, not willing to let her out of my arms for even a second. She fell asleep on the way, exhausted from the ordeal. Back in our room, as my wife and I sat there watching our little girl sleep, the reality of what had almost happened really sank in. Our Christmas trip, our holiday adventure, had turned into the most terrifying experience of our lives. I was at the airport trying to catch a cab to my sister's place for Christmas Eve. The airport was packed. You know how it gets during the holidays. People rushing around with their luggage, kids crying, Christmas music playing over the speakers. I'd just flown in from Chicago and I was pretty tired from the flight. I finally managed to grab a cab after waiting in line for what felt like forever. The driver seemed nice enough, helped me with my bag, asked where I was headed. I told him my sister's address and we set off. It was already getting dark outside and I could see all the Christmas lights as we drove through the city. At first, everything seemed normal. The driver was quiet, which was fine by me. I was looking out the window, watching the city go by, thinking about seeing my family. It had been a while since I'd visited, and I was looking forward to spending the holidays with them. We'd been driving for maybe 15 minutes when I first noticed something was off. The cab started to drift a little to the left. Not much, just enough that I noticed. I figured maybe the driver was just adjusting his position or something, so I didn't think much of it at first. But then it happened again. This time the cab drifted further into the other lane before the driver corrected. I sat up a bit straighter, starting to pay more attention to what was going on. I looked at the driver in the rearview mirror, trying to see if he looked tired or distracted. That's when I realized something was seriously wrong. The driver's eyes were half closed, and his head was starting to nod forward. I leaned forward, asking if he was okay. No response. I asked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Suddenly, the cab swerved sharply to the left. We were heading straight into oncoming traffic. I saw headlights coming towards us, getting closer by the second. It was like time slowed down. I could see the shocked faces of the people in the other cars, hear the blaring of horns. I didn't even think. I just reacted. I reached forward, grabbed the wheel, and yanked it hard to the right. The cab swerved back into our lane, narrowly missing a collision. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, but we weren't out of danger yet. The driver was completely unresponsive now, slumped over the wheel. I was half standing, half crouching between the front seats, trying to control the car from the back seat. It was awkward and terrifying. I had to steer with one hand while trying to reach the pedals with my foot. Cars were honking all around us. I could see people's confused and angry faces as we weaved through traffic. I was desperately looking for a place to pull over, but we were on a busy street with cars parked along both sides. I managed to slow the cab down, but I knew I needed to stop completely. Up ahead, I saw a gap between parked cars. It wasn't very big, but it was the best option I had. I steered towards it, praying I could fit the cab in without hitting anything. The tires screeched as I pulled in. I hit the brakes hard and we jerked to a stop. For a moment, all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing and the idle of the engine. Then reality came crashing back in. I reached over to check on the driver. He was pale and sweating, and I couldn't tell if he was breathing. I shook him, called out to him, but got no response. I knew I needed to call for help. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. When the operator answered, I tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out in a jumble. I had to take a deep breath and start over. I told them where we were, that the cab driver was unresponsive, that I'd had to take control of the car to avoid a crash. While I waited for help to arrive, I kept checking on the driver. I'd taken a first aid course years ago, and I was trying to remember what to do. Should I try CPR? Move him out of the car? I felt so helpless, just sitting there watching him and hoping he'd start breathing normally. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes before I heard sirens. An ambulance pulled up, followed by a police car. The paramedics rushed over to the cab. They pulled the driver out and started working on him right there on the sidewalk. One of the paramedics asked me what happened, and I explained as best I could. They told me the driver had likely suffered a heart attack. I watched as they loaded him into the ambulance and sped off. Then the police officers started asking me questions. They wanted to know every detail. When I first noticed something was wrong, how I took control of the car, where we'd been and where we were going. I answered as best I could, but it all felt like a blur. One of the officers told me I'd probably saved not just my own life, but the lives of other drivers on the road. But I didn't feel like a hero. I just felt shaken and exhausted. They had me write out a statement right there in the back of a police car. My hand was still shaking as I wrote, and I had to keep stopping to collect my thoughts. It was surreal, sitting there on Christmas Eve, writing about how I'd nearly died in a cab. We'd been planning this Christmas getaway for months. My wife and I wanted to escape the city, you know? Just a quiet holiday in a small town. We found this cute Airbnb online, all rustic charm with a fireplace and everything. It looked perfect. We arrived in town late in the afternoon on Christmas Eve. The place was just like the pictures, a cozy little house with Christmas lights strung up outside. The owner had left the key under the mat, so we let ourselves in. Inside, it was even better. There was a Christmas tree in the corner, and the whole place smelled like pine and cinnamon. We spent the evening settling in, unpacking our stuff, and just relaxing. We had a simple dinner and watched some Christmas movies on the TV. It felt so good to be away from the hustle and bustle of the city. We went to bed early, looking forward to a peaceful Christmas day. I'm not sure what time it was when I woke up. It must have been the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. Then I heard it. Voices. Not just any voices, but unfamiliar ones coming from inside the house. I nudged my wife awake. She heard them too. We lay there for a moment, frozen, trying to make sense of what was happening. Were we dreaming? Had someone broken in? The voices were getting louder, more animated. It sounded like more than one person. I could hear footsteps too, moving around downstairs. My wife grabbed my arm, her grip tight with fear. We got out of bed as quietly as we could. I grabbed my phone, ready to call 911 if needed. We crept to the bedroom door and listened. The voices were clearer now. It sounded like a man and a woman, maybe more. They were talking and laughing, not trying to be quiet at all. I took a deep breath and opened the bedroom door. The hallway was dark, but I could see light coming from downstairs. We made our way to the top of the stairs, our hearts pounding. And that's when we saw them. There were 4 people in the living room. 2 couples, it looked like. They had suitcases with them and were moving around like they owned the place. One of them was putting something in the fridge. Another was sitting on the couch. I called out, asking who they were and what they were doing in our rental. They all turned and looked at us, surprised. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then one of the men stepped forward. He said they had rented this place for Christmas. He showed me his phone with the Airbnb confirmation. I felt a cold wave of realization. Somehow, the owner had double-booked the house. I tried to explain that we had also rented the place, that we were already settled in, but they didn't seem to care. The man who had shown me his phone started getting angry. He said they had driven for hours to get here and they weren't leaving. The situation escalated quickly. Voices were raised. The other man joined in, saying it wasn't their problem that the owner had messed up. They had paid for the rental and they were staying. My wife tried to calm things down, suggesting we could call the owner to sort it out. But it was the middle of the night on Christmas Eve. No one was answering. As the argument got more heated, I started to feel uneasy. These people were becoming aggressive. One of the women started poking around our stuff, picking things up and putting them down. When I asked her to stop, she just glared at me. The first man, the one who seemed to be the leader, took a step towards us. He was bigger than me, and there was something in his eyes that made my stomach twist. He said we had two choices. We could leave now, or they would make us leave. I looked at my wife. I could see the fear in her eyes. We were outnumbered, and things were getting dangerous. I made a split-second decision. I told them we needed to get our things from upstairs. They watched us as we went back up to the bedroom. As soon as we were in the room, I locked the door. My wife was shaking. We could hear them downstairs, their voices getting louder again. I wedged a chair under the doorknob for extra security. We were trapped, but at least we had a barrier between us and them. We tried calling the police, but in this small town, there was no immediate response. They said they'd send someone when they could, but it might be a while. We were on our own. The night that followed was the longest of my life. We could hear them moving around downstairs, opening and closing doors, shuffling things around. Every now and then, one of them would come upstairs and try the door handle. Each time, my heart would race, wondering if this would be the moment they decided to break it down. We heard the sound of glass breaking at one point, then laughter. They were drinking, getting rowdier. We huddled together on the bed, barely breathing, straining to hear what was happening. As the night wore on, the noises became more concerning. We could hear them arguing among themselves, their voices rising and falling. At one point, there was a loud thud that shook the floor. Had they broken something? Were they fighting? Each new sound brought a fresh wave of fear. I kept checking my phone, willing it to ring with news that help was on the way, but nothing came. Outside, I could see the sky starting to lighten. Dawn was approaching, but it brought no comfort. Around what must have been early morning, things got quieter downstairs. We couldn't tell if they had left or just fallen asleep. We sat there, straining our ears for any sound. The silence was almost worse than the noise had been. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, we heard a vehicle start up outside and drive away. We waited, barely daring to hope. 10 minutes passed, then 20. No more sounds came from downstairs. Slowly, cautiously, we moved the chair and unlocked the door. I went first, my wife close behind me. The hallway was empty. We crept down the stairs, dreading what we might find. The living room was a disaster. Empty bottles everywhere, cushions thrown around, a lamp knocked over and broken on the floor. But the intruders were gone. We were at this Christmas market in Munich. It was our first time in Germany, and we thought it'd be a great experience for the kids. The market was everything you'd imagine. Wooden stalls selling ornaments and gifts, the smell of roasted chestnuts and mulled wine in the air, Christmas lights everywhere. My wife and I were trying to keep an eye on our two kids, aged 8 and 11, while navigating the crowded streets. At first, everything was great. The kids were excited, pointing at all the colorful decorations and begging to try every sweet treat they saw. We bought them some gingerbread and hot chocolate, and we were all enjoying the festive atmosphere. The market was packed, though. It seemed like the whole city was out that evening. As we were making our way through the crowd, I started to notice something odd. There was this group of people who kept appearing near us. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was crowded, after all, but after a while, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching us. Every time I turned around, I'd catch a glimpse of one of them looking our way. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. We kept moving through the market, stopping at different stalls. The kids wanted to go on a small carousel they'd spotted, so we headed in that direction. That's when things started to go wrong. As we approached the carousel, the crowd suddenly seemed to close in around us. It happened so fast. One moment we were walking together, and the next I felt someone bump into me hard. I stumbled, nearly losing my balance. When I steadied myself, I realized my wallet was gone. I immediately reached for my wife's hand, but she wasn't beside me anymore. The crowd was pushing and shoving now. I could hear people yelling, but I couldn't understand the German. I called out for my wife and kids, trying to spot them in the sea of faces. That's when I saw my wife a few feet away, clutching our daughter. But our son wasn't with them. Panic set in. I pushed through the crowd towards my wife, calling our son's name. People were running now, and I couldn't tell if they were running from something or if they were the ones causing the chaos. I reached my wife and daughter, and we frantically searched for our son. Then I heard it, a child's scream that I recognized instantly. It was coming from somewhere in front of us, but I couldn't see over the heads of the adults around me. I started pushing forward, my wife and daughter right behind me. As we moved, I could see people falling, others stepping over them. It was like nothing I'd ever experienced before. Finally, I saw him. Our son was on the ground, people stumbling over him as they ran. He was curled up, trying to protect himself, but people just kept coming. I lunged forward, throwing myself over him to shield him from the stampede. I could feel feet hitting my back as I covered him, desperately trying to pull him up. I managed to get him to his feet, but he was dazed and couldn't stand properly. I scooped him up in my arms, turning to find my wife and daughter. They were there, terrified but unharmed. We huddled together, trying to figure out what to do next. As the crowd thinned out, we realized the extent of what had happened. My son was injured. His arm was swollen and he had cuts and bruises all over. My wallet was gone, and so was my wife's purse. We had no money, no credit cards, and worst of all, no passports. We needed to get help, but we didn't know where to go or how to communicate. None of us spoke German beyond a few basic phrases. I approached a nearby stall owner, trying to ask for help. He seemed to understand we were in trouble and pointed us towards what looked like a security office. At the office, we tried to explain what had happened. The security staff didn't speak much English, and we didn't speak German. It was incredibly frustrating, trying to convey the urgency of our situation through gestures and broken phrases. Finally, someone there called for medical help. An ambulance arrived, and the paramedics immediately focused on our son. They were talking rapidly in German, and I felt helpless, not understanding what they were saying about his condition. They motioned for us to get in the ambulance with him. The ride to the hospital was surreal. Christmas lights and decorations flashed by the windows as we sped through the streets. Our son was lying on the stretcher, looking small and vulnerable. My daughter was crying silently, and my wife was trying to comfort her while looking just as scared. At the hospital, everything was a blur of white corridors and foreign voices. They took our son for x-rays while we waited, feeling lost and alone in a strange place. A nurse tried to ask us questions, but the language barrier made it nearly impossible to communicate effectively. Hours passed. We sat in the waiting room, surrounded by other patients and their families, all speaking German. The cheerful Christmas music playing softly in the background felt like a cruel joke. Here we were, in a foreign country on Christmas Eve with our injured son, no money and no identification. Eventually, a doctor came to talk to us. He spoke some English, thankfully. He explained that our son had a fractured arm and several bruised ribs. They needed to put a cast on his arm and keep him overnight for observation. The relief of knowing he would be okay was overwhelming, but it was quickly replaced by a new wave of worry. How were we going to pay for this? What were we going to do about our lost documents? We were allowed to stay with our son in his hospital room. As he slept, the reality of our situation sank in. We were stranded in a foreign country with no money and no identification. We had no way to pay for the hospital bills or even buy food for ourselves. Our Christmas vacation had turned into a nightmare. I tried to use the hospital phone to call the U.S. Embassy, but it was late on Christmas Eve and I couldn't get through to anyone who could help us immediately. We were told we'd have to wait until after the holiday to get assistance. So there we were, spending Christmas Eve in a hospital room in Munich. Our son was in pain, our daughter was scared and confused, and my wife and I were completely overwhelmed. I was stuck at Denver International Airport on a layover. My connecting flight had been delayed for hours and it was getting late. The airport was quieting down, with most of the shops closed and only a few tired travelers milling about. I was exhausted, having been traveling all day, and the thought of spending the night on an uncomfortable airport chair was not appealing. As I was considering my options, I noticed another traveler who seemed to be in the same boat. He was a middle-aged man, well-dressed, probably a businessman. We started chatting about our delayed flights and the inconvenience of it all. That's when he mentioned he was thinking of getting a hotel room for the night instead of waiting at the airport. It seemed like a good idea, and we decided to split the cost of a ride to save some money. We used one of those ride-sharing apps to call for a car. It was late, so we had to wait a bit longer than usual. When the car finally arrived, it was an older model sedan, nothing flashy. The driver was a man in his 40s wearing a baseball cap and a worn-out jacket. He didn't say much as we got in, just confirmed our destination and started driving. At first, everything seemed normal. We left the airport and got on the highway. I was sitting in the back with the other passenger, both of us looking at our phones, not paying much attention to the route. But after about 15 minutes, I started to notice that we weren't in an area that looked like it had any hotels. The buildings were becoming sparse, and the streetlights were fewer and far between. I looked over at the other passenger, and I could see he was starting to look concerned too. He asked the driver if he was sure this was the right way to the hotel. The driver mumbled something about a shortcut and kept driving. That's when I really started to pay attention to our surroundings. We were now on a road I didn't recognize, with open fields on either side. There were no other cars around, and the only light was coming from our headlights. I tried to pull up our location on my phone, but the signal was weak, and the map wouldn't load. The other passenger was now visibly nervous, repeatedly asking the driver where we were going. Suddenly, the driver took a sharp turn onto a dirt road. The car was bouncing around, and I could hear gravel hitting the underside of the vehicle. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. I demanded that the driver stop the car and let us out. Instead of slowing down, he sped up. The other passenger tried to open his door, but it was locked. We both started yelling at the driver to stop, but he ignored us. Then, without warning, he slammed on the brakes. The force threw me forward, and I hit my head on the back of the front seat. When I looked up, I saw that we had stopped in what looked like an abandoned lot. There was an old dilapidated building nearby, but otherwise it was just empty land all around us. The driver turned around in his seat and pulled out a gun. He pointed it at us and demanded all our money and valuables. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The other passenger immediately started taking out his wallet and watch. I was frozen for a moment, unable to believe this was happening. The driver was getting agitated, waving the gun between us and shouting for us to hurry up. With shaking hands, I took out my wallet and phone. The driver told us to put everything on the front passenger seat. As we did this, I noticed that the other passenger was trying to slip something into his shoe, probably some cash or a credit card. The driver must have noticed too, because he suddenly got out of the car and yanked open the back door on the other passenger's side. He grabbed the man by his shirt and started searching him roughly. I saw an opportunity and lunged for the driver's gun, which he had lowered while searching the other man. What happened next was a blur. I managed to get my hand on the gun, but the driver was strong. We struggled, and I heard the other passenger yelling. The gun went off, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I'd been shot. But it was the driver who let out a yell of pain. The bullet had grazed his arm. In the chaos, the other passenger managed to get out of the car. He was yelling for me to run. I let go of the gun and scrambled out of the car. The driver was on the ground, clutching his arm. We ran towards the old building, hoping to find a place to hide or maybe a phone we could use. As we ran, I could hear the driver shouting behind us. We reached the building and found a broken window. Without hesitation, we climbed through it, cutting ourselves on the broken glass. Inside, it was pitch black. We stumbled around, trying to find a safe place to hide. The floor was littered with debris, and we could hear rats scurrying away as we moved. We found a small room that might have been an office once and huddled in a corner. We were both breathing heavily, trying to be as quiet as possible. Outside, we could hear the driver's voice getting closer. He was threatening us, saying he would find us and make us pay for shooting him. For what felt like hours, we sat in that dark room, barely daring to breathe. Every sound made us tense up. At one point, we heard footsteps in the building. They came close to our hiding spot, then moved away. Eventually, everything went quiet. We didn't know if the driver had left or if he was just waiting for us to come out. We debated in whispers about what to do. Neither of us had our phones. They were still in the car. We had no way to call for help. Finally, after what must have been several hours, we decided to risk leaving our hiding spot. We crept through the building, jumping at every sound. When we reached the window we had come through, we peered out cautiously. The car was gone. There was no sign of the driver. We climbed out of the window and started walking. We had no idea where we were or which direction to go. The sky was starting to lighten. Dawn was approaching. We walked along the dirt road, constantly looking over our shoulders, afraid the driver might come back. After about an hour of walking, we finally saw lights in the distance. As we got closer, we realized it was a gas station. We practically ran the last few hundred yards. The attendant looked shocked when we burst in, dirty, cut up, and frantic. We asked him to call the police, and he did. We were on the road in our rented RV, heading to my grandparents' place for Christmas. It was supposed to be this big family reunion. My parents, my sister, her husband, and their kids. We thought it'd be fun to make a road trip out of it, you know? See some sights along the way, have some family bonding time. The first day was great. We were all excited, singing Christmas carols, playing road trip games. My dad was at the wheel, looking all proud of himself for mastering this huge vehicle. Mom was navigating, and the rest of us were just enjoying the ride. We even stopped at this cool roadside attraction, one of those giant ball of twine things. Totally tacky, but we loved it. As we got further into our journey, the landscape started to change. We were heading into some pretty remote areas. The roads became less maintained, and we saw fewer and fewer other vehicles. It was beautiful, though. Snow-covered mountains in the distance, vast open spaces. It felt like we were the only people for miles. That's when things started to go wrong. The RV began making this weird noise. At first, it was just a slight rattling, and we all joked about Dad's driving. But then it got louder, more persistent. Dad kept saying it was probably nothing, but I could see him glancing nervously at the dashboard. Suddenly, there was this loud clunk, and the RV started to slow down. Dad was pressing the gas, but we were losing speed fast. He managed to pull over to the side of the road just as the engine died completely. We all sat there for a moment, not quite believing what had happened. Dad and my brother-in-law got out to take a look at the engine. The rest of us stayed inside, watching them through the windows. It was freezing outside, the kind of cold that hurts your lungs when you breathe. After a while, they came back in, looking defeated. Neither of them knew much about engines, especially not RV engines. We tried to call for help, but that's when we realized we had no cell service, not one bar. We were in the middle of nowhere, with a broken-down RV and no way to contact anyone. That's when the first real wave of fear hit me. I looked at my family, and I could see the same realization dawning on their faces. We decided to wait it out. Surely another car would come along soon, right? We had food, water, and the RV would keep us warm. It wasn't ideal, but we thought it would just be a matter of hours before we got help. As the day wore on, the temperature outside dropped even further. We could see our breath inside the RV. The heater was working, but it was struggling against the intense cold. We huddled together under blankets trying to conserve heat. Night fell and still no other vehicles had passed. We rationed out some of our food for dinner, trying to stay positive. We played cards, told stories, anything to keep our minds off the situation. But as we settled in for the night, I couldn't shake this feeling of dread in the pit of my stomach. The next morning, we woke up to a world of white. It had snowed heavily overnight, and the RV was practically buried. Any hope of another vehicle passing by seemed to vanish with that snow. We were trapped. That's when I noticed my dad looking pale and shaky. He's diabetic, and with the stress and the cold, his blood sugar was all over the place. We had some of his medication, but not a lot. Mom tried to hide it, but I could see the worry in her eyes as she helped him check his levels. As the second day wore on, our situation became more dire. The food was running low. We hadn't packed for more than a day or two. The water was freezing in the pipes, making it harder to stay hydrated, and Dad was getting worse. He was trying to put on a brave face, but I could see him wincing in pain, his hands shaking. We tried everything we could think of. We made signs and put them in the windows. We tried to dig the RV out, but the snow was too deep and the cold too intense. We even tried to get the engine running again, but it was hopeless. By the third day, we were in real trouble. The food was gone. We were melting snow for water. Dad was slipping in and out of consciousness, his body unable to regulate his blood sugar. The kids were crying, scared, and hungry. I've never felt so helpless in my life. That afternoon, as we sat in a silent, cold RV, I heard something. At first, I thought I was imagining it. But then I saw my sister's head snap up too. It was the sound of an engine. We all scrambled to the windows, peering out through the frost. And there it was, a snowplow, slowly making its way down the road. I've never seen anything so beautiful in my life. We started shouting, waving, doing anything we could to get their attention. The plow slowed as it approached us, and I saw the driver's eyes widen as he realized there were people in the RV. What happened next is a blur. The plow driver called for help on his radio. Soon there were emergency vehicles, paramedics checking on Dad, people helping us out of the RV. As they loaded Dad into an ambulance, I remember looking back at the RV, our home and our prison for those 3 terrifying days. I was at the airport, surrounded by holiday decorations and the buzz of travelers. My backpack was stuffed with hastily packed clothes and a few wrapped gifts. I'd decided to surprise my family for Christmas, booking a last-minute flight across the country. The ticket was expensive, but I thought it'd be worth it to see their faces when I showed up unannounced. As I waited at the gate, I noticed how packed the flight was going to be. People were clustered around the boarding area, many wearing Santa hats or ugly Christmas sweaters. A family with young kids was trying to keep them entertained, the parents looking stressed but excited. An elderly couple sat nearby, holding hands and smiling at the children's antics. When we finally boarded, the plane was as crowded as I'd expected. I squeezed into my middle seat, nodding politely to the woman by the window and the man in the aisle seat. The woman immediately put on headphones and closed her eyes, while the man pulled out a thick book. As we took off, I couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and nervousness. I'd never been a fan of flying, but I kept reminding myself of the surprise waiting at the end of this journey. I tried to distract myself by watching the in-flight movie, but I couldn't focus. About an hour into the flight, I noticed a commotion a few rows ahead. A flight attendant was leaning over a passenger, speaking in hushed but urgent tones. I couldn't make out what was being said, but the concern on the attendant's face was clear. Other passengers were starting to notice too, craning their necks to see what was happening. Suddenly, the passenger stood up and rushed to the bathroom at the back of the plane. As they passed by, I caught a glimpse of their face, pale and sweaty, with a pained expression. The flight attendant followed closely behind, looking increasingly worried. Over the next half hour, the atmosphere on the plane changed. There was a tension in the air, with people whispering to each other and casting nervous glances towards the back of the plane. The flight attendants were moving back and forth more frequently, their faces tight with concern. Then the captain's voice came over the intercom. His tone was calm, but there was an underlying urgency that made my stomach clench. He announced that due to a medical emergency, we would be diverting to the nearest airport. He assured us it was just a precaution, but I could feel the anxiety rippling through the cabin. As we began our descent, I saw the flight attendants preparing the ill passenger for landing. They had oxygen masks on them, and even from a distance I could see they looked terrible. Their skin had taken on a grayish tinge, and they seemed to be having trouble staying conscious. We landed at a small airport I'd never heard of. Through the window I could see emergency vehicles waiting on the tarmac, their lights flashing in the dimming evening light. As soon as we came to a stop, paramedics boarded the plane and rushed to the sick passenger. What happened next was something I never expected. Instead of letting us deplane, the captain announced that we would all need to remain on board. Apparently, there was concern about the nature of the passenger's illness, and health officials wanted to assess the situation before letting anyone leave. Hours passed. We were stuck on the plane, with limited information about what was happening. The sick passenger had been taken away, but we were told we couldn't leave. People were getting restless and angry. Some were demanding to be let off. Others were worried about missing their connecting flights or holiday plans. As night fell, the situation got worse. We were finally allowed to deplane, but instead of entering the airport, we were led to a separate building. It was some kind of hangar, hastily converted into a quarantine zone. Cots were set up in rows, with makeshift barriers creating some semblance of privacy. That's when they told us the news. We would be quarantined for 48 hours. The sick passenger had shown symptoms of a highly contagious illness, and they needed to ensure it hadn't spread to the rest of us. My heart sank as I realized I would be spending Christmas in this sterile, unfamiliar place, surrounded by strangers who might be carrying a dangerous disease. The first night was the hardest. The lights in the hangar were kept on, making it difficult to sleep. People were crying, arguing with the health officials, or frantically trying to contact their families. I lay on my cot, staring at the ceiling, wondering how this surprise trip had gone so terribly wrong. As Christmas Eve dawned, the reality of our situation really set in. We were given basic toiletries and some clean clothes, but the atmosphere was grim. Health workers in protective gear came around regularly to check our temperatures and ask about symptoms. Every cough or sneeze from a fellow passenger sent a ripple of fear through the group. The airport staff tried to bring some holiday cheer, setting up a small Christmas tree and playing carols over the speakers. But it felt hollow and almost cruel in our circumstances. I watched as a mother tried to comfort her crying children, promising that Santa would find them even here. The elderly couple I'd seen at the airport sat huddled together on a cot, looking lost and frightened. As the day wore on, paranoia started to set in. People began eyeing each other suspiciously, wondering if their neighbor might be infected. I found myself obsessively checking my own temperature, convinced that every little ache or sniffle was a sign of the illness. Meals were delivered in disposable containers, slid across tables by workers in protective suits. The food was bland and cold, but it was the least of our concerns. What we really craved was information, but updates were infrequent and vague. Christmas morning arrived, and instead of the joy and family time I'd been looking forward to, I was lying on a cot in a hangar, surrounded by miserable strangers. Some people tried to make the best of it, exchanging small gifts of snacks or magazines from the vending machines, but mostly there was a heavy silence broken only by muffled sobs or frustrated sighs. As the second day of quarantine dragged on, tensions began to boil over. Arguments broke out over small things. Someone talking too loudly on their phone, another person coughing without covering their mouth. The health workers had to intervene several times to calm things down. I found myself retreating into my own thoughts, trying to block out the noise and stress around me. I kept replaying the moment I decided to book this flight, wishing I could go back and change my mind. The surprise I'd planned for my family now seemed naive and foolish. Just when it felt like we couldn't take anymore, we received news. The tests had come back and it appeared that the illness wasn't as contagious as initially feared. We would be released the next morning, pending final health checks. We were on this hiking trail in Hawaii, just a normal family Christmas trip. Me, my parents, and my two younger sisters. The trail looked beautiful, all lush and green. It was supposed to be an easy hike, you know? Something we could all do together. At first, everything was great. The air was warm and humid, typical Hawaii weather. We were taking photos, pointing out colorful birds, and just enjoying being together. My youngest sister was excited about some pretty flowers she found along the path. About an hour into the hike, I noticed the sky getting darker. It wasn't unusual for brief showers in Hawaii, so we didn't think much of it. My dad mentioned we should pick up the pace a bit just in case. The trail started to get a bit muddy, but nothing too bad. Then the rain started. It wasn't heavy at first, just a light drizzle. We pulled out our light rain jackets, thinking it would pass quickly, but it didn't. Instead, it got heavier. The sound of the rain hitting the leaves around us got louder and louder. We started to worry when the trail began to get really slippery. My mom suggested we turn back, but we were already halfway through. We thought it might be quicker to keep going forward. That decision, I still think about it. The rain just kept getting worse. It was pouring now, and we could barely see a few feet in front of us. The trail was turning into a small stream. We were all soaked, and my sisters were starting to get scared. I remember trying to calm them down, telling them it was just a bit of rain. But then we heard this roaring sound. At first I couldn't place it. It sounded like a freight train, but we were in the middle of a forest. That's when I saw it, a wall of water rushing down the trail towards us. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. Everything happened so fast after that. My dad yelled for us to get to higher ground. We scrambled up the muddy slope next to the trail. The water was rising so quickly. Within minutes, the trail we had been on was completely submerged. We clung to trees, trying to stay above the rising water. I had my arm around my youngest sister, holding her tight against the trunk of a large tree. The water was so strong, pulling at our legs. I could feel the tree roots shifting under the force of the water. That's when I saw something that still haunts me. There was another group of hikers further down the trail. They hadn't managed to climb high enough. I watched helplessly as they were swept away by the flood. Their screams, I can still hear them sometimes. The water kept rising. It was up to our waists now, even though we were clinging to trees on what used to be a slope well above the trail. The rain was relentless, making it hard to see or hear anything. We were shouting to each other, trying to make sure everyone was still there, still holding on. I don't know how long we were there. It felt like hours. My arms were aching from holding onto the tree, and I was terrified of losing my grip. The water was so cold and the current so strong. Every few minutes something would bump against my legs. Branches, I hoped, but I was too scared to look. At some point I realized I couldn't hear my family anymore. The roar of the water was too loud. I could barely see through the rain, but I managed to make out my parents and one of my sisters in nearby trees. But my youngest sister, I couldn't see her. I started screaming her name, panic taking over. I wanted to let go, to swim and find her, but I knew if I did, I'd be swept away too. I've never felt so helpless in my life. The not knowing was the worst part. Was she okay? Had she been swept away like those other hikers? As it got darker, the situation felt even more desperate. We were cold, exhausted, and terrified. The water wasn't rising anymore, but it wasn't going down either. We were stuck, and I wasn't sure how much longer we could hold on. Then, through the rain and the roar of the water, I heard a new sound. It was faint at first, but it got louder. A helicopter. I've never been so happy to hear anything in my life, but as it got closer, I realized how difficult a rescue would be. The trees were so dense, and the rain was still pouring down. The helicopter hovered above us, but they couldn't get close enough because of the trees. They dropped a rescue worker down on a cable. It was incredible to watch, this person navigating between the trees, being battered by the wind and rain. The rescue worker reached my youngest sister first. I watched as they secured her in a harness and she was lifted up into the helicopter. One by one, they rescued my family members. I was the last one. By the time they got to me, my arms were shaking so badly I could barely hold on. As the rescue worker reached me, I remember him yelling over the noise, asking if I was hurt. I shook my head, too exhausted and cold to speak. He got the harness around me, and suddenly I was being lifted. The force of the wind and rain as we rose above the trees was incredible. Being pulled into the helicopter was a blur. I was shivering uncontrollably. Someone wrapped a blanket around me and I looked around frantically for my family. They were all there, wet, shaken, but alive. My youngest sister was huddled in my mom's arms, crying quietly. As we flew away, I looked down at the forest. The peaceful trail we had started on was now a raging river. Trees were uprooted, debris was floating everywhere. It was like looking at a completely different place. We arrived in Las Vegas a few days before Christmas. The city was buzzing with holiday energy, all lit up and festive. I'd decided to take my mom on this trip as a special treat. She'd always wanted to see Vegas, and at 72, I figured it was about time. Our hotel was one of those big, fancy ones right on the strip. The lobby was decked out with Christmas decorations, a massive tree, and garlands everywhere. Mom was thrilled, her eyes wide as she took it all in. We checked in and headed up to our room. It was nice, clean, with a view of the city lights. Mom kept saying how beautiful everything was. The first couple of days were great. We took it easy, knowing Mom couldn't handle too much walking. We visited some of the casinos, watched a show, and just enjoyed the atmosphere. Mom even won a little money on the slot machines, which made her day. On the third day, I noticed Mom seemed a bit tired. She said she was fine, just not used to all the excitement. We decided to have a quiet day, mostly hanging out by the pool. The weather was warm for December, and it felt good to relax. Christmas Eve came, and we had plans to go to a special dinner. Mom was looking forward to it, but when I went to her room to pick her up, something was off. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, looking pale. She said she felt a bit under the weather, maybe coming down with a cold. I suggested we skip the dinner and order room service instead. She agreed, which was unusual. Mom hates to miss out on things. That night, things took a turn. I was woken up by a call from Mom's room. Her voice was weak, and she said she couldn't stop coughing. I rushed over and found her in bed shivering despite the warm room. She looked awful. Her face was flushed, and she was having trouble catching her breath. I called the front desk for a doctor, but they said it would be faster to go to the emergency room. So there we were, at 2 a.m. on Christmas morning, in a taxi headed to the hospital. The streets of Vegas were still lively, such a contrast to how we were feeling. The ER was packed. Apparently holidays in Vegas mean lots of accidents and illnesses. We waited for what felt like hours. Mom's cough was getting worse, and she was burning up with fever. I kept trying to get the attention of the nurses, telling them my mom was really sick, but everyone there looked really sick. Finally, a doctor saw us. He listened to Mom's lungs and immediately called for more tests. They took her away for a chest x-ray, leaving me alone in the busy waiting room. I was surrounded by drunk tourists with minor injuries, families with crying kids, all while my mom was somewhere in the hospital, seriously ill. When the doctor came back, his face was serious. He said Mom had severe pneumonia and needed to be admitted right away. They were moving her to the ICU. ICU, those 3 letters hit me like a truck. This was supposed to be a fun Christmas trip, and now Mom was in intensive care. They let me see her briefly before taking her up. She looked so small in the hospital bed, hooked up to monitors and with an oxygen mask on her face. Her eyes were closed, and for the first time, I realized just how fragile she was. I spent Christmas Day in the hospital waiting room. The contrast was surreal. I could hear Christmas music playing softly in the background while doctors and nurses rushed around. Occasionally, I'd catch glimpses of the Las Vegas Strip through the windows, all bright and cheerful, while I was living through this nightmare. The doctors ran more tests. They said Mom's condition was unusual for normal pneumonia. They were concerned about how quickly she had deteriorated. One doctor mentioned something called Legionnaire's disease, which I'd never heard of. As Mom fought for her life in the ICU, I learned more about this disease. It's a severe form of pneumonia caused by bacteria that can grow in building water systems. The doctor asked about our hotel, our activities, if we'd use the hot tub or the shower in our room. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just some random illness. Mom had gotten sick from our hotel, the place that was supposed to be a treat, a special Christmas gift. I felt sick to my stomach. The next few days were a blur of hospital corridors, medical terms I didn't understand, and long hours by Mom's bedside. The doctors confirmed it was Legionnaire's disease. They started her on strong antibiotics, but warned me that recovery could be slow and difficult, especially for someone her age. I had to deal with the hotel and health authorities. The hotel management seemed more concerned about their reputation than my mom's health. Health inspectors were sent to check the hotel's water systems. I later found out we weren't the only cases. Other guests had gotten sick too. Mom was in and out of consciousness. When she was awake, she was confused, asking why we weren't at the Christmas dinner, not realizing days had passed. Watching her struggle to breathe, seeing all the machines she was hooked up to. It was terrifying. The ICU was a world of its own. The constant beeping of monitors, the hushed voices of the medical staff, the antiseptic smell, it all became sickeningly familiar. Other families in the waiting room were going through their own nightmares. We'd nod to each other, a silent acknowledgement of our shared fear and hope. Days turned into a week. Mom's condition improved slightly, then worsened again. The doctors explained that this was common with Legionnaire's disease, especially in older patients. Each time her fever spiked or her oxygen levels dropped, I felt like I was on a horrible roller coaster. I spent New Year's Eve in the hospital cafeteria, picking at a sandwich while fireworks exploded over the Vegas Strip. The sound was muffled, but I could see the flashes of color through the windows. It felt like the world was celebrating while my world had stopped. I was at O'Hare International Airport in Chicago, waiting for my connecting flight home for Christmas. The place was packed with holiday travelers, everyone rushing around with their luggage and shopping bags. I'd been traveling for hours already, and I was exhausted. My flight wasn't for another 2 hours, so I found a seat at the gate and settled in. The gate area was noisy, with people talking on their phones and kids running around. I remember thinking how much I just wanted to be home already. I tried to stay awake by scrolling through my phone, but my eyes kept getting heavy. I figured it would be okay to rest them for a bit. I leaned back in my chair, still hearing the bustle of the airport around me. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in complete silence. At first I was disoriented. The lights were dimmed, and there was no one around. I thought maybe I'd just dozed off for a few minutes and everyone had boarded the plane. But as I became more alert, I realized something was very wrong. The entire gate area was empty. Not just my gate, but as far as I could see down the terminal. There were no passengers, no staff, nothing. Just rows and rows of empty seats. I checked my watch and my stomach dropped. It was past midnight. I'd slept for hours, right through the boarding calls and everything. I grabbed my bag and ran to the gate desk, hoping to find someone, anyone, but there was no one there. The computer screens were dark. I tried to use the phone at the desk, but there was no dial tone. That's when the panic really started to set in. I walked down the terminal, my footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. All the shops were closed, their security gates pulled down. The restaurants were dark. It was like being in a ghost town. I kept expecting to see someone, a cleaner, a security guard, anyone, but there was no one. I tried to find an exit, thinking I could at least get out of the terminal. But every door I tried was locked. I even tried to push through the emergency exit, but an alarm started blaring and I quickly stepped back. The last thing I wanted was to get in trouble for trying to break out. As I walked further into the airport, things got even weirder. I found myself in areas I'd never seen before, back corridors and service areas. It was like being backstage at a huge theater, seeing all the inner workings of the airport, but everything was shut down and silent. I tried using my phone to call for help, but there was no signal inside the terminal. I couldn't even get online to send an email or message. I was completely cut off from the outside world. At one point, I heard a noise coming from one of the corridors. It sounded like footsteps. I called out, hoping it was a security guard or someone who could help me, but there was no response. The footsteps stopped, and when I went to investigate, there was no one there. Just an empty hallway with flickering fluorescent lights. I started to feel like I was in a horror movie. Every shadow seemed to move. Every little noise made me jump. The huge windows looking out onto the tarmac showed a completely empty runway. No planes, no vehicles, nothing. It was like the whole world had disappeared while I was asleep. As I wandered through the terminal, I came across an area that looked like it was under construction. There were plastic sheets hanging from the ceiling and construction equipment scattered around. I thought about using one of the tools to try and open a door, but I was afraid of getting into trouble. Plus, the whole area gave me the creeps. The plastic sheets moved slightly, even though there was no breeze. I got out of there as fast as I could. I found myself back at my original gate, feeling completely lost and scared. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There was a small TV still on behind the gate desk. It was muted, but I could see it was playing the local news. The ticker at the bottom of the screen showed the current date and time, and that's when I realized something impossible. The date on the screen was 2 days later than it should have been. According to that TV, I hadn't been asleep for a few hours, but for 2 entire days. How was that possible? I felt like I was losing my mind. Had I been wandering around this airport for days without realizing it? But I wasn't hungry or thirsty. It didn't make any sense. I slumped down in a chair, trying to process what was happening. That's when I heard another noise. This time it was clear and unmistakable. It was the sound of a child laughing. I stood up, looking around wildly. The laughter echoed through the empty terminal, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I followed the sound, my heart pounding. It led me to a small play area for kids, tucked away in a corner of the terminal. The play area was dark, but I could make out the shapes of small slides and climbing structures. As I got closer, the laughter stopped, and then I saw it. Sitting on one of the tiny chairs was a stuffed animal, a teddy bear. It hadn't been there a moment ago, I was sure of it. I approached slowly, half expecting the toy to move or make a sound, but it just sat there, staring at me with its button eyes. I reached out to touch it, to prove to myself it was real. As soon as my fingers brushed the soft fur, all the lights in the terminal suddenly blazed to full brightness. I jumped back, momentarily blinded, and then I heard voices. Lots of voices. I blinked, trying to adjust to the light, and that's when I saw them. People. Dozens of people suddenly filling the terminal. Passengers wheeling their luggage, staff behind desks, security guards walking their rounds. It was as if they had all materialized out of thin air. I stood there, frozen, as the noise level rose to a normal airport bustle. A voice came over the PA system announcing a flight boarding. It was my flight home. I looked at my watch, and it showed the correct date and time. It was as if the past few hours had never happened. I walked back to my gate in a daze, my mind struggling to understand what had just occurred. Had I dreamed it all? Was I going crazy? As I approached the gate, I saw the ground staff preparing for boarding. Everything looked normal. I handed my boarding pass to the gate agent. She scanned it and looked at me with a puzzled expression. She asked if I was feeling okay because I looked pale. I just nodded and walked down the jet bridge to the plane. It was Christmas Eve, and I was running late for my flight home. I'd spent way too long packing and saying goodbye to my roommates. The airport was on the other side of the city, and with holiday traffic, I knew I'd never make it in time if I took public transport. So I did what seemed like the sensible thing at the time. I called an Uber. The app said the driver was just a few minutes away. I waited outside my apartment building, luggage at my feet, constantly checking the time on my phone. When the car pulled up, I quickly glanced at the license plate to make sure it matched the one on the app. It did, so I loaded my suitcase into the trunk and hopped in the back seat. The driver was a middle-aged man with graying hair. He barely looked at me as I got in, just grunted a greeting and asked if I was heading to the airport. I confirmed and settled in for the ride, relieved to finally be on my way. At first, everything seemed normal. We merged onto the highway and I watched the city scenery flash by. I was anxious about making my flight, so I kept an eye on our route through my phone's GPS. That's when I first noticed something odd. The driver missed an exit we should have taken. I figured maybe he knew a shortcut or was avoiding traffic, so I didn't say anything at first. But then he missed another turn, and another. I leaned forward and politely pointed out that we seemed to be going the wrong way. The driver mumbled something about roadwork and a detour. His voice was different now, tense, almost angry. I sat back, feeling uneasy. I watched as we drove further and further away from the route to the airport. The buildings were getting sparse, replaced by empty lots and abandoned warehouses. This definitely wasn't the way to the airport, and it wasn't any part of the city I recognized. I spoke up again, louder this time, insisting that we were going the wrong way. The driver's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. He snapped at me to shut up, that he knew where he was going. The menace in his voice made me go quiet. My heart was pounding now. This wasn't just a confused driver or a misunderstanding. Something was very, very wrong. I tried to remain calm and think rationally. Maybe if I pretended everything was fine, I could catch him off guard. I casually mentioned that I needed to let my family know I might be late for my flight. I reached for my phone, trying to keep my movements slow and natural, but the driver must have been watching me in the rearview mirror. As soon as my hand touched my pocket, he swerved the car sharply to the right. The sudden movement sent me sprawling across the back seat. Before I could recover, he had pulled into an empty parking lot behind an abandoned building. The car screeched to a halt. In one fluid motion, the driver was out of his seat and wrenching open my door. He grabbed my arm and yanked me out of the car. I stumbled, nearly falling onto the cracked pavement. The driver loomed over me, his face twisted with anger and something else. Desperation, maybe. He demanded money, said he knew I must have cash for my trip. His words came out in a frantic jumble, his eyes darting around as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. I tried to reason with him, told him he could have my wallet, just please let me go. But he wasn't listening. He grabbed my bag from the car and dumped its contents onto the ground. I watched helplessly as he rifled through my belongings, tossing aside clothes and toiletries. When he didn't find what he was looking for, he turned back to me, even more agitated than before. That's when I noticed he was holding something. At first I thought it was a phone, but then I saw the glint of metal, a knife. Not a big one, but big enough. My mouth went dry. This was no longer just about money. This man was unstable, desperate, and armed. He advanced on me, waving the knife, demanding to know where I was hiding the rest of my money. I backed away, hands raised, trying to keep my voice steady as I told him I didn't have anything else. He didn't believe me. He lunged forward, grabbing my jacket, his face inches from mine. I could smell alcohol on his breath. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I didn't think. I just reacted. I brought my knee up hard, catching him in the stomach. He let out a grunt and doubled over. I shoved him as hard as I could and he stumbled backward, losing his grip on the knife. It clattered to the ground. I dove for the knife, my fingers closing around the handle just as the driver regained his balance. He came at me again, but now I was the one armed. I pointed the knife at him, my hand shaking but my grip firm. I yelled at him to stay back. For a long moment, we were at a standoff, me trembling but holding the knife out in front of me. Him, wild-eyed and panting, clearly weighing his options. I have no doubt that if he had rushed me, he could have overpowered me. But the knife was enough to make him hesitate. That hesitation was all I needed. I started backing away, keeping the knife pointed at him. He watched me, fists clenched at his sides, but he didn't move. I kept backing up, my eyes never leaving him until I felt the rough brick of the abandoned building against my back. I sidled along the wall, getting further and further from the driver and his car. He stayed where he was, watching me. When I reached the corner of the building, I took a chance. I turned and ran. I ran harder than I've ever run in my life, expecting at any moment to hear footsteps behind me, to feel a hand grab my shoulder. But the footsteps never came. I ran until my lungs were burning, until I couldn't run anymore. When I finally slowed and looked back, there was no sign of the driver or his car. I found myself on a street I didn't recognize, surrounded by more abandoned buildings and empty lots. I was lost, alone, and still clutching the knife. My phone was gone, left behind in the car or lost in the struggle. I had no way to call for help, no way to contact my family or the police. I walked for what felt like hours, jumping at every sound, terrified that the driver might have followed me after all. Eventually, I came across a gas station. The attendant took one look at me, disheveled, terrified, still holding the knife, and nearly pushed the panic button. I managed to convince him I wasn't a threat, and he let me use the phone to call the police. What followed was a blur of police questions, visits to the station, and failed attempts to locate the driver or his car. They never found him. The license plate he had used was stolen. The car likely was too. The police said I was lucky to have escaped, that things could have ended much worse. I was on this Greyhound bus heading home for Christmas. It was one of those overnight trips, you know? I'd been putting off buying plane tickets, thinking I could save some money, and ended up on this bus instead. It was packed, every seat taken. I managed to get an aisle seat, which I usually prefer, but on a crowded bus like this, it just meant I was constantly being bumped by people walking past. The trip started off normal enough. We left the station around sunset. I remember watching the city lights fade away as we hit the highway. The bus was noisy at first, people chatting, kids fussing, all that. But as it got darker, things started to quiet down. People were settling in for the night, trying to get some sleep. I couldn't sleep though. Never can on these things. So I just sat there, headphones in, watching the darkness outside the window. Every now and then, we'd pass through a small town and I'd see the glow of streetlights, maybe a 24-hour diner or gas station. Then it was back to darkness. It must have been a few hours into the trip when I first noticed something wasn't right. The bus seemed to be swaying more than usual. At first I thought maybe we were on a particularly windy stretch of road. But then I realized the movements weren't matching up with the road. We'd suddenly jerk to one side, then slowly drift back. I took out my headphones and looked around. A few other passengers were awake and they looked concerned too. The woman across the aisle from me caught my eye. She raised her eyebrows, silently asking if I'd noticed it too. I nodded. The swaying got worse. We'd go straight for a while, lulling us into a false sense of security, then suddenly swerve. Each time it happened, I gripped the armrest tighter. I could hear murmurs of confusion and fear spreading through the bus. I leaned forward to look at the driver. From where I was sitting, I could just see the side of his face in the rearview mirror. His eyes were half closed, his head nodding forward. Then I saw it. His eyes closed completely for a second, his head dropped, and the bus drifted across the lane. My stomach dropped. He was falling asleep at the wheel. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. We were on a busy highway going who knows how fast, and our driver was dozing off. I looked out the window and saw headlights streaming past us. One wrong move and we could collide with another vehicle or go off the road entirely. People around me were starting to panic. The guy in front of me was shaking his sleeping wife awake. An older man a few rows up stood up, grabbing onto the seats to keep his balance as the bus swayed. He called out to the driver, trying to get his attention. The driver's head snapped up at the sound. The bus straightened out for a moment and I felt a rush of relief. But it was short-lived. Within minutes, we were swaying again. The driver was fighting to stay awake, but he was losing the battle. Someone suggested we try to call the bus company, but of course no one had their number. A few people were on their phones, probably trying to call 911, but we were in the middle of nowhere. Even if they got through, how would help reach us in time? The situation was getting worse by the second. We'd swerved so far that I could feel the wheels on one side lifting off the ground. Each time it happened, there were screams and gasps throughout the bus. I was sure we were going to tip over. A group of passengers near the front were trying to wake the driver up. They were calling out, some even reaching out to shake his shoulder. But every time he startled awake, he'd be dozing again within minutes. I was racking my brain, trying to think of what to do. We couldn't just sit here and wait to crash. But in the chaos of the swaying bus and panicking passengers, it was hard to think straight. That's when it happened. We hit a rough patch of road, and the bus lurched violently to the right. I saw the headlights of a semi-truck in the lane next to us, way too close. The driver, jolted awake by the movement, overcorrected. We swerved hard to the left. For a terrifying moment, I was sure we were going to flip. The right side of the bus lifted off the ground. I was thrown against the person next to me. There were screams all around. I closed my eyes, bracing for impact. But somehow, we didn't flip. The bus slammed back down onto all wheels. The driver, fully awake now, was wrestling with the steering wheel, trying to keep us on the road. We were fishtailing wildly across the lanes. In the midst of the chaos, I saw a rest stop sign ahead. It was our only chance. I jumped up, stumbling down the aisle as the bus swayed. I reached the front, gripping the backs of seats to keep from falling. I yelled at the driver to pull over, pointing frantically at the approaching rest stop. Whether it was my yelling or his own realization, the driver started to slow down. We were still swaying dangerously, but we were decelerating. I watched, my heart pounding, as we approached the exit. For a moment, I thought we were going too fast to make it, that we'd fly right past it. But we made it. The bus lurched onto the exit ramp, nearly tipping again as we took the turn too fast. We rumbled into the rest stop parking lot, the brakes squealing as the driver finally brought us to a stop. The moment we stopped moving, chaos erupted. People were yelling, crying, demanding answers. Some rushed to get off the bus, while others were frozen in their seats, still in shock. The driver sat there, his hands shaking on the wheel, looking dazed. I stood there at the front of the bus, my legs feeling like jelly, trying to process what had just happened. We'd come so close to disaster. If we hadn't found this rest stop, if the driver had fallen asleep for just a few seconds longer. Someone had called 911, and we could hear sirens approaching. The flashing lights of police cars and an ambulance appeared in the distance. As they pulled into the rest stop, I finally let myself breathe. We were safe. Somehow we'd made it. The rest of that night was a blur of police questions, paramedics checking people for injuries, and phone calls to the bus company. They sent a replacement driver, but many passengers, including me, chose to find alternate ways to finish our journeys. There was no way I was getting back on a bus after what we'd just been through. As I waited for my ride, watching the sun rise over the rest stop, I couldn't shake the feeling of how close we'd come to tragedy. It was supposed to be a routine trip, just a long bus ride home for the holidays. Instead, it turned into the most terrifying night of my life. I've never felt so helpless, so aware of how quickly things can go wrong. Hey there again. Hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to hit the like button and to subscribe to the channel. This will really help the channel to grow and you can be notified of the new videos. And I have something more for you. I chose another video for you to watch. Just click the card here to go to the video. Hope you like it. See you there.